make the introduction. And so we're really thrilled that Arvind Mahajan at Texas A&M was willing to make the introduction. And I have to say that Rebecca was probably the easiest keynote speaker I've ever lined up. So I just want to say thank you, Rebecca, because every question I had and asked, she said, sure, no problem. I'll take care of that. I'll cover that. So I'm really thrilled to introduce Rebecca. Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard Business School. She has just got a terrific new book out. And if you pay attention, there's lots of opportunities for you to get your hands on that book here. And so with that, Rebecca, I'm just going to turn it over to you because you've got a great series of slides to add a presentation today.
Jeff, thank you very much. And I'm sure Arvind will join us before too long. We know what Zoom land is like and unexpected roadblocks come up. I am thrilled and honored to be speaking to the roundtable this afternoon. My thanks to everyone who has logged in this afternoon. It's easy to get Zoom fatigue, and so I will try and be at least mildly interesting. Let me share my slide deck. So I'm here to talk about the book I just published, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And the focus of my presentation is really on the relationship between research and practice. And in particular, I thought I would take you a little bit under the hood and show you how my many years of work in innovation and my more recent focus on purpose has really inspired this work and my research, my teaching, and this book. So here's the book. It comes out of a course I teach at the Harvard Business School. I started about 8 years ago with 28 students, and the course now enrolls 300, which is nearly a third of our second year class. And the dean has asked me to take over the first year course in leadership and governance in order to bring some of these ideas to the classroom. The course and the book try to answer the question, what, if anything, can business do? Given the enormous problems we face, what can be done? So I want to talk about three things, like why reimagine capitalism in the first place? And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think I have learned about how business might be able to help, and then talk about implications for us, for academics. So why reimagine capitalism? You should know that I think capitalism, and in particular free and fair markets, are one of the great inventions of the human race, an unparalleled source of innovation and productivity and general overall good things. But I think right now we have problems. Three problems in particular. We appear to be unable to deal with the problem of climate change. California is literally on fire as we meet. A third of Bangladesh flooded this summer. The fires, the droughts, the floods, they are coming, they are here. We're seeing accelerating inequality, not everywhere. Some countries have brought many people out of poverty, notably China, but within much of the developed world, the gap between those who have and those who don't is accelerating. Right here in the US, for example, social mobility has been declining for some years and is now lower than in many other of the developed nations. Statistically, the average American cannot hope that their children will do better than they do, which is creating all kinds of political problems. So our institutions are under enormous stress, and so is our social capital, so is our trust. I sometimes say the biggest reason to reimagine capitalism is that according to Edelman, more than half of the world's population think it's not working for them, and this is before the pandemic. And a majority of Americans under 30 say they prefer socialism to capitalism. They probably mean they'd like decent healthcare, but still, for those of us who are fans of capitalism, this is a huge problem. I personally do not believe we will solve the great problems of our time without capitalism, but I do think it needs to be reimagined. So I believe that the clear solution to the huge public goods problems I've just outlined is the traditional solution. That is the balanced institutions of a liberal democracy. Free markets, good government and free politics, balanced by the rule of law, a free press, respect for minority rights, and a vote for Labour. This should not be a radical idea to this group. It's a standard idea in political science and in the literature on development economics that the market has to develop in tandem with good institutions that hold it in balance. To give a clear example, why are we not addressing climate change? Because we do not yet have the kinds of regulations and taxes in place that would price carbon as the massive negative externality that it is. And why do we not have that? There are many reasons, but one is because a number of firms in the fossil fuel industry have been literally flooding the political system with money, denying the reality of climate change, and giving huge amounts of money to politicians who promise not to regulate fossil fuels. So this is the classic balance, but right now in many parts of the world, it's badly out of balance. So if this is the answer, what does business have to do with it? Why should we even talk about it as business school professors? Well, I probably don't need to tell you this, but our institutions are under stress. We're facing a landmark election next week, unparalleled levels of polarization and anger, not just here, and I deliberately put up photographs from England and France. This is a global phenomenon that worldwide, many people do not believe the elites, that would be us, are delivering for them. And so moving to a first pass, governments should just fix it, solution is at the moment tricky. So let me give you a theory of change in 15 minutes. So first, I think there's a lot of money to be made in tackling these problems. This is an old idea, I'm sure, to many of you, but there are increasingly clear business cases for tackling the large social issues and making money. One of my favorite examples is Walmart, that took $1 billion to the bottom line by re-engineering its trucking fleet to reduce fuel use. Even for Walmart, $1 billion on the bottom line was a lot of money. Another is a CEO friend of mine who said, Rebecca, I think sustainability is bullshit. And I said, yes, Fred, I know you think it's bullshit. He said, well, everyone that wants to work for, everyone I want to hire thinks it's important. So would you come and talk about it? So huge number of business models here at Harvard. We have more than 300 cases focused on opportunities to create shared value, many at $1 billion scale. So it's definitely possible to tackle at least some of these social problems as a business person. The good news is that even individual firms can make a difference. Of course, they make a significant difference to the people who work with them and for them and the ecosystems in which they're embedded. But even a single firm moving in an industry can demonstrate that there is a business case for doing the right thing, can drive technology down the learning curves, can begin to change consumer tastes. Consumers are increasingly less likely to identify sustainable with shoddy. And we're seeing consumers willing to shift their purchases if they can be convinced that the sustainable product is just as good and provides just as good services as the comparable product. So shared value can have significant effects on the industry in which it's embedded. Perhaps you know the examples of Beyond Meat in the plant-based meat industry, and the thousands of companies in that area really changing the conversation about meat, or of course, Mr. Musk in transportation. But change is hard. People sometimes say to me, well, if it's this easy, why doesn't everybody do it? And here I draw on my first 20 years of research at MIT as the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management, a complete coincidence, but deeply ironic, given this is the problem I have spent my career obsessed with. So this is simply a graphic illustration of a disruption. I actually had the fortune of working with Kodak, GM, and Nokia. And if I can summarize 20 years of research, why is change hard? Well, firms deny it's happening. They say they won't make any money and that they can't get it done. So that's what's happening right now. We clearly need to change. We're clearly on the edge of a transformation in how we think about the economic system. And yet many firms are saying, go away, don't bother me. It's too much work. I won't make any money. So here, I think purpose can be really, really helpful. And for me, this is where purpose and sustainability really blend. Because as we think about the shared value opportunity, going in the wrong way, sorry. Can purpose help? Forgive me, I clearly have something very strange going on in my deck here. Let me just have a quick look. I see what it is. So can purpose help? To which the answer is, of course, yes. Can purpose help? So what does purpose do? In this slide, I have attempted to summarize hundreds, if not thousands of studies, some I suspect written by people on the call. So thank you very much. And feel free to disagree with this graphic. It's coming out in Management Science next year. But what does purpose do? Well, a lot of things. But at root, it gives you much higher levels of strategic alignment, much higher levels of intrinsic motivation, and much higher levels of trust. I'm not saying for a moment that this means purpose is a ticket to superior financial performance. Authentic purpose is expensive. So really demonstrating meaning and authenticity, investing in a shared vision, doing the work required to persuade the firm that you are for real is expensive. But once developed, purpose has very, very powerful effects. And as I look back on my research, the fact that it tends to kickstart trust is absolutely critical. Because, well, to go back to my earlier research, what do we know about firms that manage to make this transition? What do we know about firms that don't crash and burn? What I think I know is that, yes, they needed to have a clear business model. And yes, they needed to realign the organization around what they were trying to do. But the single most important thing was high levels of trust. Trust that the future business would take care of the old business or vice versa. Trust that if an individual took the risk to build the new way of doing things and failed, the firm would take care of him. Trust that if I lost money for a little bit, I would still be okay. The reason I got interested in purpose in the first place was, as I look back on my research in this area, I kept finding that the firms who managed to make the transition were those who had high levels of purpose. So I think it's all about purpose. And that's why purpose-driven firms are so important, is because they will be the ones to pioneer the new business models. Now, it's clear, I think, that action by individual firms will not be enough. That even the most woke firm out there will have problems that they cannot solve through their own individual business model. And so the big question, I think, is whether we can trigger the collective case for action. Because let's be clear, the problems we face are largely collective action problems. One of the things I say to the students is, if business were owned by one person, do you think they would fix climate change? To which they nearly always go, well, yes. I mean, climate change is a very significant risk to the stability of the world's financial systems, to the stability of the world's food supply, to the shipping, you name it. If we didn't have a collective action problem, I would solve it. So the question is, can we solve these problems through collective action? Now, there's some evidence that we can. I mean, many of these have a classic prisoner's dilemma structure, but we've got, Elinor Ostrom's famous example of lobster fishing in Maine. We've got the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which is the main source of safety and training in the nuclear power industry, hugely successful, and the International Chamber of Commerce, which essentially moderates international trade and is completely voluntary. Internal adjudication courts, internal regulation of rules and procedures. So we know that there are times and places where business can really cooperate. So what do we need? Well, all we need, This is straight from Ostrom. It's a focus on the long term because this is a repeated game. A strong business case for cooperating because cooperation has to be more attractive than defecting. The ability to monitor and the ability to sanction. So we know that. And mostly you can do this in an international context, industry by industry, when we think of what groups like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil are doing, or the efforts in textiles to pull labor abuses out of the supply chain. They have thought long and hard about these. But I think what's often missing is this, which is it's usually the purpose-driven firms who are leading the way. And that seems to me consistent both with their having a broader strategic vision and with this, very intriguing research that if you have known pro-socials in the mix, it's much easier to sustain cooperation. Certainly the cooperative efforts that I know a little bit about in textiles and in palm oil, you have this very interesting interaction between, yes, there's a business case, but I am irrationally committed to doing the right thing. So I will follow through on my commitments. And for me, as we think about how business can solve these problems, it's all about the interaction between the moral case, the personal case, and the business case. But that doesn't mean you have to choose. That means you're always managing the interaction between them. Now, in this case, of course, these efforts are only moderately successful. Pioneered by purpose-driven firms, initially heralded as the solution to these very large collective action problems, we're now seeing that it's very difficult, that there are often firms who say, yeah, I see the business case, but I'm busy and I can't handle it in the short term, and I'll be gone in a couple of years, and why should I bear the extra expense? So even though in principle, the collective case for action is very strong, in both cases, you're seeing massive threats to the brands of the large Western firms involved, and in some case, real uncertainty about the longevity of the supply chain. When you have firms that don't want to play, it can be very hard to sustain that cooperation. So groups like this, and there are hundreds of them, have made very significant progress in monitoring, in developing new standards, and bringing new firms along, but it's clearly not the whole answer. Well, where else could you go? Well, maybe investors could could enforce cooperation. So here's the wild and crazy idea. Really rich people could save the world. Now, I never can make up my mind if this is hopeful or creepy, but by some measures, you could put 12 people in a room together and they would control about 50% of the world's traded financial assets. Well, that's really creepy. But it's also hopeful in that those 12 people, and we know who they are, and we actually know they're having this conversation, are increasingly convinced that climate change is, yes, a major threat to the world's economics. And interestingly, the asset owners that they represent are increasingly coming to that decision too. So maybe investors could help us with with these public goods problems. Here, I think ESG potentially has a major role to play. I'm sure many of you are deeply enmeshed in the conversations, but the idea is if we could get auditable, replicable, material measures of a firm's impact, non-financial impact and non-financial performance, not only might that be able to direct purpose-driven capital and perhaps far-seeing capital to those purpose-driven firms that are catalyzing change across industries, but also allow investors to monitor and sanction firms. Because you can't get cooperation if you can't measure. You can't see how the firms are really changing if there are no metrics. So hugely interesting area, potential place for change. Another huge question, and this is a variant of the cooperation, which is, could universal investors internalize the externalities? Are there investors who are so big that these major public goods problems are not externalities? And my leading example is the Japanese government pension fund, where the Hiro Mizuno, who until recently was the chief investment officer, came to believe that it was his fiduciary duty to address climate change. He had $1.7 trillion in assets, that's 1% of the world's equities and a large chunk of all the other financial assets. And he came to believe that chasing alpha was just a waste of time. that most of his money had to be in passive investors, and the biggest threat to their performance of those passive portfolios was massive problems like climate change and social exclusion. And so he almost single-handedly has wrestled Japan onto the ESG track and really started the conversation in Japan about what do we need to pay attention to for the long-term health of the entire society. So he's also playing a major role internationally in the big conversations around this. Now, that said, I bet some of you at least are thinking, well, this is all very well, Rebecca, and maybe individual firms can make a difference in individual industries. And maybe cooperation will take us some distance by region or by industry. And perhaps the investors will perhaps take us some way towards solving the problem of climate change. But these huge public goods problems can, in the end, only be solved by government. And for me, that's particularly salient in the case of the problem of inequality and exclusion. So then the question I raise is whether business can help rebuild our institutions. So here's the case for action. Again, the economic case. This is crude data, and I see I need to update it, but in general, so-called free societies, that is societies with a balanced, inclusive institutions, free markets, and free politics, greatly overperform other kinds of societies. We really don't seem to have a good alternative to this kind of balance between markets and governments as a way to drive growth. We know there are examples happening all over of business partnering with government. Very exciting work in early education in Minneapolis and in schooling in Columbus. I recently came across a new consortium of CEOs in Orange County, California, working enormously closely with their local universities and community colleges to increase the pool of people of color in the talent market. We are still you're seeing many businesses working with states and cities on the problem of climate change, actively advocating for a price for carbon, and that governments everywhere address the problem of climate change. And more recently, just in the last few weeks, you may have become aware of them, although I know all these groups have been working for a while, a whole bunch of organizations trying to mobilize businesses here in the US to support the integrity of the upcoming election. I personally believe that the single thing business should be focused on in this front is what I call civics rather than politics, and in particular, pulling money out of the political process. More than 70% of Americans say that the system is rigged, that the only policies that get passed are those that favor the interests of those with money and power. And some of the recent research in political science suggests that they may well be right. And that kind of perception is yet one more factor driving the decline of our democracy. This close engagement between business and government has happened before and in very positive ways. Now, of course, it can happen negatively. When it happens negatively, it's called crony capitalism. But there have been times in history, I identified at least 5, and I profile 3 in my book, where the private sector stepped up and said, our society is on the edge of disaster. We need to sit down and, as a society, business working with government and with the representatives of civil society, work out how we're going to build a capitalism that works for all of us. You may well be familiar with the Danish example, where the Danish Business Association works very closely with the Danish Labour Association and the Danish government, leading to policies like very significant resources available for retraining. The 3 parties work together on the COVID response plan. Denmark is one of the more equal and one of the more prosperous societies on the planet, and has very much a free market. It's has great healthcare system, but it's not socialist. People sometimes say, well, oh, this is because, you know, Denmark is full of Danes, and Danes are naturally cooperative and they like hugging each other. That's not my reading at all of the history. I think they have that system because in the 1890s, Denmark came close to collapse, and the head of the Danish Business Association actually helped create the Danish Labor Association in order to begin the conversation about what could be done. So, in summary, a pathway to systemic change. All we have to do is, here it is. I won't go through it, but I do think it's possible. And I do think it has important implications for how we think about MBA teaching and research. So in my last minute, let me end there. Firstly, I think we shouldn't ignore what's happening. This may sound super basic, but we only just managed this at the Harvard Business School, really. Until quite recently, you could do an MBA at Harvard and not see more than a single case on climate change and no case at all on inequality. And you would have had discussion of institutions. We've always been very strong on that, but we fixed that. So now every student has at least some sense that something is not, something is not right. The question of what to do, of course, we leave up to the students, but we tried very hard to give them the basic data. And let me just say, if it's of any use to anyone on the call, we have a note on climate change and a note on inequality and, short pieces that try and give a balanced view of the facts, man, nothing but the facts. I think it's super important that we re-examine shareholder value. As far as we can tell, at the business school, we never tell the students that they have a duty to maximize shareholder value and to forget everything else. Indeed, now that I'm teaching the course on leadership and corporate governance, I can tell you we absolutely don't tell them that. We tell them they have a fiduciary duty of care, candor, and loyalty, and sometimes that means maximizing shareholder value. But I think there's a deep, deep issue here, which in another stream of research I call the crisis in the theory of the firm, which is this. The deepest normative commitments of capitalism are to prosperity and freedom. Professor Friedman, when he said the moral duty of the company is to maximize profits or to increase profits, he said that because he thought that would maximize prosperity and freedom, social welfare and opportunity. But markets only meet these commitments when they're genuinely free and fair. When, for example, massive externalities go unpriced. And in the case of something like coal-fired electricity, these externalities are enormous. $10 worth of coal-fired power. This is a conservative estimate, but my colleagues in the School of Public Health tell me that that generates $8 worth of harm to human health. And those in economics tell me it gives you $8 worth of climate damage. So that $10 worth of coal-fired power gives you $16 worth of damage. When you see that kind of ratio, the operation of the market is not guaranteed to maximize social wealth. And most obviously, if firms can lobby to fix the rules of the game in their own favor, the same goes through. So if I can lobby to make myself a monopolist, there's no guarantee. I mean, that maximizes shareholder value. It's great for me. No guarantee it maximizes shareholder value or social welfare or freedom. So, and let's remember the collective economic case for addressing these problems is very, very strong. So I'm not suggesting we stand on the moral case. But again, for me, it's all about talking about the interaction between the two. Once you realize that the moral case for maximizing shareholder value is extraordinarily tenuous in the current situation, then I think it's of aid and comfort to the point that, and doing it's going to bring the whole system down. So maybe we should stop. Let's talk about the money that is to be made. I would guess everyone on this call is doing this on a regular basis, but there is lots of money to be made. Let's make sure our students know about it. And last but not least, let's do the research. In writing this book, I drew on the work of hundreds of researchers. So thank you if you're on the call. I also became aware that there's a lot we don't know. I think we need to know much more about building cooperation that really works. There's been exciting work done in rewiring finance, but if you're in that area, you know that is humming. So let's keep it humming. And of course, rebuilding our institutions and the role of business in that. What's that line between being a great civic actor and contributing to the common good and subverting the conversation for your own use? I mean, how do we think about that? What do public-private partnerships really look like on the ground? Difficult and complicated. And last but not least, I think we need to change the normative frame. I think talking about purpose, telling our students that you can run a firm with a purpose and still give a decent return to investors, that while making money is essential and satisfying your investors is critical, it is in many cases not the point. The point is to build a prosperous, free, just, sustainable society. So on that note, I will close with my favorite cartoon and say, in the end, it's just the right thing to do. This is from Tom Toro at the New Yorker. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. We know that's wrong. We know there's a path forward. We need to support our students in walking that path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was terrific. We asked you to cover a lot in a very short amount of time, so thank you for that. And we do have some questions coming in, so I'm just going to jump right into the questions.
Please.
So, the first question, what do you mean by non-financial aspects of firm performance, and how can it be measured?
Oh, let me give you a very concrete example. I think most of us believe that the employees of the firm are critically important to the firm's performance. But whether they feel engaged or asleep at work, how much they've invested firm-specific capital in the firm so that they really, really understand the firm and know what makes it to work, how much initiative they take, how much training they have, what the turnover rate is, how much I have to spend hiring new people. I mean, there's a whole bunch of factors that we're fairly clear have a real bearing on financial performance. But if you go to conventional financial accounts, you don't see any of it. And similarly, I mean, if I'm dumping all my waste into the river and treating the people in my supply chain terribly, I mean, you as an investor would probably want to know. I mean, there's a recent example of a firm in England called, I'm going to get this wrong, but Bobo Shirts. Anyway, very cool clothing company, totally cool brand. And sort of everybody knew that labor conditions in their factories weren't that great. But then there were a couple of exposés and they were basically running something very close to slave labor in the north of London. And the brand collapsed. it just like, where's the company? It is no company anymore. So just to give you examples. And so when I say non-financial measures of performance, there's lots of measures that I think increasingly investors would like to be able to see.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think Arvind's here, so he'll have some questions for you as well. So for our, can you say something about the scale of our society here in the United States, and whether your solutions are more appropriate for smaller societies or countries, where collective action is easier to execute?
Of course. Everything I have outlined is easier in smaller groups. That's one of the things we know. Right? If there are only 4 of us in the room, it's a lot easier to get to a cooperative outcome, particularly if we know each other and our kids go to school together, than if there are 4,000 of us in the room and I can hardly see the other side and I don't know who you are. But that's our challenge. We don't get to punt. And I do believe, if we think about the US, that just as it has a deep history of individualism and a proud history of individualism, it also has a deep history of caring about the community. Tocqueville thought that we were a nation of people who had meetings with each other like all the time. That's what Americans did. And he was amazed at the number of social links and social connections that we had. So I don't think it's impossible. Absolutely not. We have cooperated at scale before. We do so locally every day. Once we see the urgency of the challenge and a way forward, I'm very hopeful we'll find a way to do it again.
Great, great. Maybe I'll add hope to the gratitude words that I'm going to add onto the things today. Arvind, I think you have some questions. I think you have some, and then actually I will continue to monitor the Q&A as well.
Okay, so is the show on? Are we on, or am
You're
I
on? It's a go. You're alive. And I should apologize to everybody. I gave Arvind the wrong time, so I'm going to take all credit for this. And so, Arvind, we're live, and you're on the spot. So I'll let you shoot some questions.
Okay, well, terrific. I'm sorry I missed Rebecca's earlier part, but I've seen her many times before. I have the book with me, and it is just a very thought-inspiring book. And I'm grateful you are here, Rebecca. I'm sure there have been a bunch of questions already, but one of the questions I had was, do you see any countries right now or the businesses in countries, different countries, which are following a kind of model consistent with what you are proposing in reimagining capitalism?
Oh, for sure. Yes. This is not something I made up. I would never have dared to write this book if I didn't think it was already starting to happen. In my presentation, I talked about what's happening on the ground in Denmark. And yes, they have a 100-year history and they're a small homogeneous society. So you say, well, no big deal. But it is happening in Germany. And I think it's happening in the US. I really do. I mean, when we look at how so many firms have responded to COVID, how many CEOs stepped up and said, I have real responsibilities here, and I am going to follow through. And, you know, these kinds of analyses, everyone on this call knows it's far too early to tell, but the early evidence suggests that they're doing better. These firms are more resilient, that their stock price and earnings multiples are holding up better. And certainly they feel better. I was on a fascinating presentation with Caroline Diwa, who's a partner in the San Francisco office at McKinsey. And she was asked, you know, what are you seeing change in the firms you work with? And she said, well, first, they've all learned they can change much, much faster than they thought, and they don't want to go back. So that was super interesting. But the second thing she said was, and nearly all the CEOs I'm working with have discovered that it's not just about what I do, it's who I am. It's not just doing, it's being. I nearly fell off my chair. You know? She said, no, this is the thing that the CEOs have discovered. This is the only way to manage through these kinds of crises. And now, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish here. There's a long, long way to go. But is the conversation open? Absolutely. A year ago, when I would say to mixed groups of executives, I really think we have to make progress on these problems, or we risk a society falling into either left or right populism, and you won't like either of them. You know, the CEOs looked at me and said, well, that's really interesting, Rebecca. Yeah, great. Tell us again about climate change, because everyone gets climate change. Now everyone's like, can we talk about that? Like, what would that mean in practice? What would we do? How would we think about that? So I think there are many firms already moving, and I try and outline them in my book, or at least some of them, and lots more talk. And, you know, talk is cheap, but it's the necessary first step to action.
Yeah, no, thank you. A related question is, and this is so timely, your book is so timely, although you have been teaching this course for quite a while, and it has a lot of following at Harvard, and it's influencing many other academics as well, including in this group. You have a large group of faculty and administrators who can take some of these messages back into their classrooms in the curricula. So I have a specific question for you. For example, I, not as an administrator, but as an academic who teaches MBAs, in finance, one of the founding principles, the basic principles we teach for resource allocation is the net present value decision rule. When I am teaching that foundational allocation principle, how can I insert this larger mindset in the minds of the students who have barely learned to calculate free cash flows and who are barely learning the capital asset pricing model and the cost of capital. So how do I, in a concrete way, convey to them where to capture all these factors your book addresses in their decision rules?
So Arvind, I hesitate to answer because knowing you, you've already thought this through in detail, and because you're a finance professor and I am not. But let me take a cut. It feels to me as if there are two ways you could introduce these issues. The first is by countering the temptation in any NPV calculation to assume you can just project the cash flows and the world is going to stay as it is. And so I'm sure you already teach this, but with my own students, I push them hard on scenario analysis, just basic 2x2 scenario analysis. What are the two major uncertainties that could change these cash flows? Because when you ask that question in many firms today, it's things like climate change and whether we can get the employees we need and the political risk we face. And really pushing the students to think, well, are there growth opportunities we don't see? So many firms are so stuck on, well, we're just doing what we're doing, and NPV often reflects that. And the second place, and I know you know this, is in a conversation around the discount rate. Because if we value the world's future at 8%, we're not going to leave the forest standing, and we're going to poison the ocean. Because at 8%, almost anything 30 years from now is worth nothing. And so really having the conversation about what does the discount rate mean? And why 8%? Could it be 3%? Like, well, what do we think the long-term rate of return in the economy is? Again, that sounds a little bit philosophical, but my experience, I don't know if this is true for you, is the students are really up for these larger conversations right now. And if you can link it to something really concrete, like an MBV calculation, that's a great place to start.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful explanation. And I think all thoughtful academics, I think we think about our theories in the context of the human circumstance. And sometimes our theories do not really capture many aspects of decision-making, which are intangible, which are non-pecuniary. And then the other challenge is to teach the bosses of the students, is training the trainers. And that gets to be a yet bigger challenge. But like you said, and I love the optimism in your book, it does not underestimate the challenge and the difficulty of pushing this through. But there is that hopefulness that if together we make a concerted effort, this is indeed possible. And I love that part about the book. You may have already commented on this, Rebecca, but what is the role of regulation and tax policy in encouraging firms to indeed, and the CEOs, to indeed think in these larger contexts of climate inequality and the fragility of the institutions which run these organizations?
Both regulation and taxes are central to solving the problems that we face. Nobody really likes either. I spent 10 years on the compliance committee at a Fortune 200 pharmaceutical company. And so I am intimately familiar with the idea that regulations can often be badly designed, incoherently implemented, and generally not a good time. And similarly, I'm not a big fan of paying my taxes. But the thing is, we need them. We need them both. One way to think about the problems, the sort of moment we're in that I find helpful, is we've told ourselves that if we just focus on me right now, everything is going to be fine. But it's not true. It never has been true. Any parent of a 2-year-old knows that the big human task is persuading all of us to think about us and later. And what both regulations and taxes do is they think about us and they think about later. So let's just take the problem of climate change, for example. Right now, in many parts of the world, it is cheaper to use renewable energy, and that's fantastic, and we're beginning to see that transition. But in many other places, it isn't. If you're building a plant right here in New England, for example, it's going to be hard to, if you're going to just maximize raw profits, to put solar panels on the roof or put up windmills or try and buy green power. It's going to increase your costs. But as I said in my talk, that's because we're not regulating the harm caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So when we burn fossil fuels, we're causing massive social harm. So it looks as though it's cheaper to burn coal than to put up solar panels. But if I take the real costs into account, that's the wrong decision. And so one way to think about regulation at its best is as the guardrails for a genuinely free market, where prices reflect real costs, where the actions, when I maximize profits, I maximize social welfare. And a tax for carbon or a regulation on carbon would be critically important to making that happen. Similarly with inequality, and I think we're seeing this as lots of firms grapple with diversity and inclusion in the wake of the horrible incidents we saw this summer. I had the chance to talk to several senior managers who said, I'm very committed, I'm doing what I can inside the firm. But as I think about this, I realize that it's the educational and healthcare systems in my region that need to be fixed. That yes, there's things I can do and I will take that on, but there's no way that we as firms can solve this problem. And I've even heard a few people say, maybe we need more taxes. Because that's what taxes do, right? One of the things that taxes do is make sure everybody can play. Mm-hmm. And as capitalists, as a capitalist myself, I'm really committed to the idea that one of the things that makes capitalism so amazing is freedom of opportunity. That anyone can start a firm, that if you don't like the firm you work at, you can go and work for other firms. Well, that ability is predicated on decent healthcare, decent education, and of course, reasonable antitrust law. So, I think rules and regulations and taxes, they're key. And that's why I stress so much that business needs to really, instead of just having decided that government is the problem, we hate government, drown it in the bathtub, go away, the business needs to recognize that we need government. We need a democratically accountable, transparent, capable government that knows what it's doing to partner with us. Because otherwise, the alternative to no taxes and to taxes and regulations is not no tax and no regulation. It never was. It's a mess. So that's at least what I think.
No, excellent. And Jeff tells me that our audience has some questions for you. Jeff, if you will help me in reading them out.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a couple that are sort of following off some of your questions about the NPV question and maybe a bit more from the student perspective. Do you have some more recommendations on instructional best practices? And then really, does MBA education need maybe an experiential coach model so that students can practice before being thrust into business? So maybe a bit more on the instruction and also the student experience that could help them understand this process.
You're going to get a very biased answer from me because I'm from the Harvard Business School. So I think cases are hugely important. And we have been really pushing, and I know other schools have too, Michigan and Yale. I don't mean to hold out HBS, but these kinds of issues feel to me particularly well taught by cases. Because, for example, I saw in the chat one question, which is, well, purpose sounds all right, but what do I tell the students when purpose conflicts with profit? And that is, of course, the question. Are you sure it conflicts with the profit? How much? But a case is the best way to have that conversation. And so we've tried to write, I personally tried to write some cases that really put the students in the seat of someone who's saying, well, I could do the right thing. Not sure I should. How do I think about this? How do I think about the pros and cons? Who am I responsible to really? And it's having the conversations in particular cases, because otherwise you're just having a conversation over a beer. you know, all the real learning, I think, not all, but lots of real learning happens when you're really grappling with a particular moment. So one of my favorite cases, for example, is a case I wrote on Walmart. And I talk about what happened at Walmart in 2005 when Katrina hit. And it's a long time ago. Most people won't remember, but it was a massive hurricane, millions of people displaced. And Walmart, the CEO of Walmart said to his managers, I don't care what it costs. You're not counting budget. Get food and relief into the area. And for the CEO of Walmart to say that was like, whoa. I mean, I've spoken to people who were in that call and they were like, I could not believe he said that. But they did it. They got amazing PR. And what the CEO took away is the incredible enthusiasm and engagement among the workforce. And so a few months later, he said, right, I'm announcing massive targets for energy reduction, waste reduction. Walmart is going green. And the case is about, well, who is he kidding? Is this a PR move? Is this because Walmart thinks it can squeeze the smaller competitors by putting in environmental regulations? Like, what is going on in this case? And that feels to me like at least one way. Of course, there are many others. There's some fantastic simulations. John Sterman at MIT has a fabulous sequence of simulations. My favorite is the fish game, which if you're not familiar with and you're on the call, you should know about, where everybody is allocated to be a fisher person and you send them out to sea and you have them fish. And they fish out the oceans, invariably. They fish out the oceans when they're taking a course called Sustainability and Business. And that's because, and what's so great about this game, I love this game because you play it a few rounds and the students start to realize something is wrong and they start trying to cooperate. And so they stand up, they negotiate with each other, they negotiate a cooperative agreement, they sit back down, they break it. Then you get the conversation about, well, how does this look in the real world and what's really going on? So I think there are many modes of learning, but the more we can get the students in the position of making the decisions, I think the better off the students will be.
Actually, I think you're seeing some of the Q&A. There's a question about, talk to us about the drivers at HBS to increase the presence of justice, equality, environmental issues into the curriculum and classroom conversations, the roles and influence of students, faculty, administrators in pushing these changes.
Jeff, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Could you try it again?
Sure. Maybe talk to us about the drivers at HBS to increase the presence of justice, equality, and environmental issues into the curriculum and classroom conversations. What are the roles and influences that you're seeing be active in making those changes?
Sure. I missed the first part. So I'm happy to talk about my own experience, but I'm sure it's idiosyncratic. So I moved to HBS just about 10 years ago. I was recruited to help found the Business and Environment Initiative. And I began by teaching the course that I described. We call it Reimagining Capitalism and the Big Problems. And so that was one small thing I did. But one of the things that became clear very quickly is that there were lots of elective courses in this space. We had a very strong social enterprise program. And we had many courses focused on individual issue areas like agriculture or the energy industry or consumer goods, where these issues were beginning to bubble up. So questions of sustainability were already all over the elective curriculum. Then the question is, well, how do you get them into the first year? And I don't know about the first year where you teach, but where I teach, the first year, the required courses are like the Army, only not, I've actually worked with the Army and it's incredibly flexible and responsible. I don't know, like the post office on a really, really bad day. It's just, everyone is teaching their thing and they bring the junior faculty into their course and they have something that works and they're sympathetic, but they're busy and everyone's asking them to do a session on international, or we should have more women, which we should, and we should have more international cases. But then, I arrive and I say, well, you should have a case on climate change, or you should talk about inequalities. So that was a a difficult few years, when we were just trying to push the first year curriculum. A number of things seem to be really helping. One is going to each course head and asking what problem they have, and then writing the case that fixed the problem. So really trying to get to know the individual course, trying to get to know the individual course instructor. I've now been at Harvard long enough that I know the people who run the other required courses, so that's super helpful too. And everyone wants to change. I mean, it's not like anyone is saying this isn't important or we don't need it. That's not the problem. It's doing it that's tough. And then there are a couple of courses which have really taken these issues on. We have a course on business, government, and the environment. Business and government, which is really all over institutions and inequality and what is the role of business and thinking about these issues. And I run the course on leadership, which is a follow-on to the course on organizational behavior. And so in these courses, we talk a ton about what is the purpose of business and how do we think about it and what is your fiduciary duty. And we have individual days where we do a climate game and get all the students to play the climate game. So it's been a kind of attack on multiple fronts, but I must stress, if you ask me to name the colleagues who are really passionate about this and really pushing hard, I would start with 10 and I'd be at 50, out of 200. So many of my colleagues are teaching courses in this area, writing cases, thinking, pushing, and I'm sure it's like this at every institution. There's really a sense that we need to move. We're not moving fast enough, but we're really trying.
Do you feel that's the same with the students? Are students becoming much more passionate and demanding about that?
Oh, the students have moved enormously. I mean, I don't know about you, but the difference between the students I was teaching 30 years ago and the students now, we asked the first year class at the Harvard Business School in February, is capitalism broken? And 50% of them said yes. Yeah, it's like, what? So tons of interest, tons and tons of interest. So that's been another move. Many of the students are clearly willing to take a cut in pay to work for a mission-driven company. Many of them want to start entrepreneurial ventures in this area or want to work for large firms. I'm asked all the time, which are the largest firms that are doing best in this area? Where can I make a difference? It's really, really striking.
Arvind, do you have some more questions? I have a few more here, but I think you may have some as well.
Well, I'll ask a larger question, and these are things I think many of the academics have been wrestling with, and I think your book is really precipitating these questions and making them more concrete. So there have been two aspects. I, being in finance, see from the eyes of a financial economist, but there are other perspectives on it. So if we want indeed to not just reimagine, but actually make a reality out of this reimagination of capitalism, we also need to educate two major components of the market, which are the consumers and the investors. Because indeed, the current version of capitalism, which tells us about wealth maximization, because it's justified by it allowing us to maximize our current and future consumption. And the consumers and the advertising and the media are all creating this demand for goods and services and obfuscating the demarcation between services and goods, which are needs as distinct from wants. To the extent the consumers are out to fulfill their wants, creating a demand for products, which the companies then readily provide because that's what their job is, to meet the demand. It doesn't really matter whether it came from a need or a want. So how do we restrain the consumers from focusing on things which really they really should value more, which is need. Who are we to tell them to make their choices more sensibly, if you will? Because it seems like telling them something from a higher pedestal than they would digest. So that's one side of my question. And the other side of my question has to do with the financial markets, where ultimately firm values and stock prices get determined. And our assumption has been in the extant theory that the markets are rational, although we are discovering with Kahneman and others that they really may not be completely rational, and which causes, because of that short-term nature, forces the CEOs, the resource allocators, to not take the long-term view, which you refer to in the book, but it forces them to take a shorter term view for mere survival and the structure of the compensation contracts. So how do we deal with these two fundamental problems? Because they are really integral to bringing the reimagination to reality.
In 2 minutes. Consumption. Nobody likes to be preached at. Many people feel they don't have the basics for survival. Certainly on a global basis, that's true. I'm always nervous when people say, well, we must stop consuming now. That might be true for incredibly privileged people like us, but there are billions of dollars of people who don't yet have light in the hut or clean water or assured food. So, that I know that's not where you were going, Arvind, but sometimes people are like, let's just stop consuming, and clearly can't do that. Second is, I think we've been waiting for at least 20 years for consumers to value sustainability and to start to be willing to pay more for it, and they're still not. It seems to be that the purchase decision is too quick, and the signals of sustainability too weak to really shape purchase behavior, particularly if you feel you have to pay more. There are exceptions. People like me, middle-aged women in Cambridge, will pay more. There are sectors like organic food where people will pay more, status goods like Tesla's, but most people will not pay more, even though they say they will. What seems to be making some headway is to introduce sustainable products that are at least as good as what you would have bought otherwise, with the same values, that are sustainable. And consumers seem to be willing to shift. Unilever claims, and I've no reason to believe this isn't true, that their sustainable brands are growing more than 40% faster than their unsustainable brands or their conventional brands, and providing 70% of the company's growth. And there is a conversation, I'm not in marketing, there's a conversation going on about how brands can shape consumer perception and consumption. And there's a fantastic book recently out called Brands on a Mission by Miriam Sidibe, which anyone who's interested in marketing on consumer behavior, I would really recommend, on what would it mean for a brand to actually try and do good and actually try and persuade consumers to change behavior. So consumers, tricky, but there are some ways in. Investors, two problems. The first is the short-termism problem you mentioned. So as a CEO, I turn to my investors and I say, I'm going to treat my people better, and I'm going to reduce our environmental footprint, and trust me, in the long run, that's going to be better. Doug McMillan at Walmart actually did this. He gave a huge pay raise to his employees, and he told the street it will drive productivity and commitment, and it's the right thing to do. And they took 20% off the value of his stock in a single day. It's like, okay. Now, it turns out he was quite right. The stock has absolutely recovered, and you can see it in Walmart's performance figures. But that would be a classic example, and that's why I think these ESG metrics are so important, is they open up a richer conversation with the investors. In those cases where there is a business case for doing the right thing, at least we should be able to communicate around it. The second issue is the one I touched on very briefly in my presentation, which is whether investors can be persuaded to internalize the systemic risks. And are they showing up in the pricing? Now, this is more your field than mine, Arvind, but I think you can squint at the price of energy stocks and think the market's beginning to price in the risk. I'm told that the real estate market in Miami is starting to price in the flood risk. Now, we know it's slow, right? I mean, the idea that markets are instantaneously rational all the time is clearly not true. And, you know, major resets in the expectation of the value of particular classes of assets, really internalizing the costs of the physical damage that climate change will bring. I think it's going to take a while, but I think it's going to happen. And it will probably happen. I mean, this is what people like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, are so worried about. They're worried it's going to happen like that. And the less sophisticated investors will be on the losing end. So, I mean, I don't know what your perception is, but my perception is like, whoa, are the investors talking about this?
Yeah.
You know, it's not clear they're doing anything, but lots and lots of talk.
Yeah, no, but that's great. That's a great answer, Rebecca. And the question's somewhat unfair because you have precipitated this conversation.
No, it's not me. Arvind, really, no. This is going on. I can't tell you how many thousands of people have been doing this. I mean, you're so kind about my book, but I can give you 30 books which are just as interesting and just as important. I mean, someone in the chat asked about Henry Mitzberg's book, Rebalancing Society. Fabulous book. So anyway, it's not me. We're all just pebbles in the avalanche, and Arvind knows why I'm saying that.
Yes, you have a chapter of the pebbles. Jeff, you had some questions there for the audience.
I do think we've gotten to most of them. There's this one about sort of you talked about sort of depending upon the wealthy to solve the problems. Do you really think a few of them will solve the world's problems by voluntarily giving up half of their fortune or more? What is your take on that?
No, of course not. For those who have nothing better to do, I have a wonderful interview. Well, I think it's really fun. Interview on YouTube with Arvind Giriadis, who wrote Winners Take All, in which he looks at me and he says, Rebecca, you have to be kidding. MBAs are destroying the planet. They're not going to give up their wealth. I mean, what are you talking about? So we had a really fun conversation about that. So two things. First, the wealthy very rarely give up position and power. They only do it for two reasons. One is they see an opportunity. That is that, yes, I may need to give up something in the short term, but I can see a road to doing better longer term. And it really is the case that institutions with more inclusive institutions, where the countries with more inclusive institutions, where the democracy is stronger and there are real tax and real regulation, rates of economic growth in those countries are much higher than places where it genuinely is the free market, but it's never a free market on its own. It always collapses to crony capitalism and a few people in charge of everything. I think Russia is the most obvious example. So I think the wealthy might be persuaded that they would be even better off if, for example, they responded to the challenge of climate change. And that's why I think we're seeing so much conversation amongst investors, is the science is really scary. And I think it's so scary that it's beginning to really communicate that if you're that rich, you can't diversify away from these risks. I mean, you can disappear into a hole in the ground, but who wants to do that? You know, and just barricade the doors. That you would be better off if we address this. So that's the first reason for change. The second reason is fear. Those three examples I gave you, Denmark in the 1990s, Germany in the 1940s, Mauritius in the 1960s, the three examples in my book, they're all examples of societies on the edge of collapse. And, you know, if the society collapses, what's your wealth? It's not there. The Germans had lived through that. Everything had been flattened. The Danes could absolutely see it. They'd lost a major war. In Mauritius, they had riots on the street. They had the army out. People were being shot. Fear of capital flight. I mean, there are these moments in history when the wealthy have said, not all the wealthy, And this, we could get into a conversation about leadership, because in every one of these three examples I've given you, there was a group amongst the wealthy who had the vision to see that the cooperative way out was the better way out. And if you ask me, you know, why did I write this book? One of the reasons I wrote this book is I wanted to get a few people in those positions thinking about this. It's like, if push comes to shove, what are you going to do? Are you going to cooperate? Are we going to build a better society together? Or are you just going to double down? And that feels to me, you know, not that the wealthy from the goodness of their hearts will open their coffers and shower the populace, because that's not fair, though. I mean, people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are giving away huge amounts of money, but that won't solve the systemic problems we face. What will solve them, or what will help solve them, is we need a massive political movement, and it would be very helpful if business were an ally and not an opponent.
I just have a quick comment, only because you talked about trust. So then you sort of fed into my question about sort of trust in business schools, which I believe some suggestions about how we build trust into the business, more trust into the business schools from the general public.
Jeff, what would be your thought on that one?
No, but I'm thinking that this impact and purpose is really, I think, a fascinating way to. Business schools are taking a bit of heat right now for some of those things. And so how do we sort of maybe change the message?
So it's really tough. I mean, I have many colleagues who think that business schools are basically evil and business people are basically evil. And that's a huge problem, because business people provide the jobs and, you know, the lights and deliver the food. And without a thriving capitalist system, we're not going to get what we think it is we need. So what can we do? Well, you know, people have accused me of this book being a massive exercise in greenwashing, and just giving cover to the capitalist class. I don't think that's what it is. I think I'm trying to shine a light on what's already happening in many places, and really set a path forward to how we could build business that works for everyone, build a system that works for everyone. And I believe that would be more profitable and much more fun. And so I think, you know, and there are hundreds of us doing this work, Jeff, as I'm sure you know. All the people doing research on whether ESG is correlated with financial performance, all the people doing work on changing models of leadership and how you really embed purpose into a firm. The people in finance working on sustainable finance and impact investing and what that would look like. So I think we're on the right track. I think we need to go further, faster, but I do think I hope we're on the right track. And I think maybe this is only a Harvard remark, but being a little less arrogant, you know, just acknowledging how many people are angry at business and why. And the idea that, yeah, there's a point, not getting instantly defensive.
Thank you, Arvind. Do you have any closing questions or?
No, I think it touched upon, the last question really touched upon something, and I think Rebecca addressed it really well. That points towards, I think in some ways, somewhat of an indictment of academia as well, because within academia, we really are quite compartmentalized and we are operating in silos. So the assumptions we make in the business school as economists, the metaphysics is very different than I see, for example, amongst my colleagues in liberal arts. The issue of trust really emerges there because I think we don't fully understand each other's disciplines and the importance they play in the larger human circumstance. And I think it is in that context I hear often from my friends in architecture, from my friends in who are painters, this notion of business school and Walmart's destroying the planet. And I think it is, again, to some extent, they have a point, but on the other hand, they don't fully understand how business contributes to their own sustainability and to everything which they do. But sometimes they need some shaking up, just like we in the business school sometimes need some shaking up, as does the Wall Street. Because again, Wall Street, I worked on Wall Street and people work very hard on Wall Street. And there are a lot of very good people working on Wall Street. But the Wall Street is perceived the same way as the business school is often perceived, that lack of trust. And I think it's just because people don't fully understand what we do in the business school. And we perhaps may have been somewhat arrogant in not going out and explaining to them what we do. And same with our colleagues in other colleges, that they are so busy in their research and doing what they do, that perhaps not only does society need a start of this dialogue, the academy itself needs more interdisciplinary collaboration to understand what we can do to help in solving larger problems.
Rebecca, we're about out of time. Any final words or anything?
Let me say one thing. Thank you. Thank you for all the work you do. We so often think change is driven by heroes, but it is not. It is driven by individuals making different choices. In my book, I talk about the fact that we need an avalanche of change and that avalanches are driven by pebbles. And all of us can never be more than a pebble. There are 9 billion people on the planet. But those of us on the call, we have the pleasure and the honor of jobs that matter, where we're talking to other people and doing research that is read. And so we can change the world. We really can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for taking the time. This was wonderful.
My pleasure, really. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. What an honor to have you start our day. And thanks everybody for joining us. We have allowed you a little break before we